All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first Balanced Weather Science video. And I'm really excited today to have one of my former colleagues, Dr. Tony Lyza, who I've known for a long time, probably longer than either of us would care to admit. Tony is one of the top scientists working on tornado research right now. He's currently at the National Severe Storms Lab as a team lead for the hazardous weather test bed. And rather than me just babbling, I'm going to let Tony tell a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Alan. So, as Alan said, I'm a research scientist here at NSSL, the NOAA National Severe Storms Laboratory. I started as a postdoc in the Cooperative Institute here at OU and NSSL back in 2020, moved up through the ranks there as a research scientist, then became a federal research scientist back in November of 2023. My primary day-to-day job is, as Alan mentioned, running the hazardous weather test bed, which is our main method for testing new products and new algorithms and technology that are developed by NSSL and other partner institutions before and testing them before they get deployed into the National Weather Service, so that forecasters and emergency managers and other end users can provide their feedback on those products and how they can how they really excel and what areas those products can improve before they make their way into full deployment into operations. Outside of that, my background is in observational severe storms research. I've done a lot of work studying the role of terrain and topography on severe storm environments and severe storm evolution. I also do a lot of work in tornado damage assessment and tornado intensity estimation, which is what we'll primarily be talking about today. I sit on the EF scale subcommittee of the ASCE and AMS Standards Committee for Wind Speed Estimation in Tornadoes. It's a committee that is working to develop a standard set series of methods for estimating the wind speeds in tornadoes and other severe convective windstorms. So I'm excited to be here and talk about some of the research going on here at NSSL in the realm of tornado intensity estimation and tornado scale science.
So thanks for that summary, Tony. And the committee that Tony mentioned, I'm also a member of. And in fact, I just voted for a couple of ballots that we had outstanding because we've been getting reminders from our committee chair, Jim Leduc, please vote.
Sent my votes in yesterday. So
yes, I was going to do it yesterday, but then they gave us an extra day, so I did it today.
Got the extension right after I hit send on both of them.
Yes. And Tony and I go way back to the Southeast. Tony did his graduate work at the University of Alabama at Huntsville and has done a lot of work on Southeast tornadoes, which obviously I'm very familiar with, having been the meteorologist in charge in Jackson for a number of years. So that was kind of where we first got acquainted. And Tony has since then come and followed me out here to Norman and to NSSL. So the reason I wanted to bring Tony on today is Tony and his colleagues, Harold Brooks and Makenzie Krocak, just did, well, I say just, it's been several months now since it was published, but a paper looking at the drought, I'll put in quote, of EF5 tornadoes. And I think that this is something that's gotten a lot of attention in the meteorological community and the broader community just in general. I think a lot of people are interested in why there haven't been any of these, highest end tornadoes. And Tony, I guess I'd just like to ask, maybe you mentioned that you do a lot of research in this area. What got you interested in this, and how did you start on it?
Yeah, so I've always had an interest in tornado intensity estimation and tornado ratings. I mean, going back to, personally, when I was a kid, I'm a tornado stats nerd, and So, you start at one end of the Dunning-Kruger curve, right? Where you have very little knowledge and very high interest and you think you know a lot, and then you realize you know nothing. And then eventually you realize you know some, but you don't know everything. And you get a better idea, a better sense of where the questions for a given subject matter lie. And in this case, when it comes to estimating tornado intensity, a lot of the questions really do exist at the higher tornado intensities, because tornadoes as a whole are hard to measure. They're hard to observe. They're not common at any given location, despite what it might seem like for some very certain locations, like up the road and more. They're still not that common. And then it's even more uncommon to have them intersect observing systems or be impacting like the network of observations, surface observations that we have across the United States. Those sites don't exist everywhere. So you have scattered locations and rare events, and you essentially have to multiply the probability of those two things together to get the probability of an observation site getting impacted directly by a tornado. And then for a stronger tornado, what are the odds that an observing site that gets hit will survive to experience the strongest winds? So we have primarily done this over the last several decades using damage, because when a tornado hits, the one thing we can count on if it hits a populated area is that there will be damage left behind. And so the history of all this goes back to Professor Fujita back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, recognizing the need to have a way to estimate tornado intensity and to estimate it quickly, because one of the keys here is that to get a somewhat accurate estimate of the wind speed needed to cause damage to a building takes a lot of in-depth analysis by engineering experts that can identify readily how the building was constructed, what the connection points on the building, on a given building, what they look like. And that can even be hard for the experts to identify if the building is blasted to smithereens. So he came up with this idea to have a scale that could estimate with some reasonable range of wind speeds the wind speeds that were needed to cause a certain level of damage. And having the range of wind speeds associated with a given type or given severity of damage allowed for the uncertainties in how a building was constructed and the uncertainties in the wind speed to building damage relationship to somewhat be accounted for. And that was the whole basis for having a rating scale, instead of assigning a precise wind speed to a tornado based on the damage, having a range of wind speeds and a rating that would ultimately be associated with a given range. So that rating range was the original Fujita scale. And when he developed that, he developed a 12 increment scale, increments from 1 to 12, from the end of the Beaufort scale, or the start of hurricane force wind speeds at 74 miles per hour, 73, 74 miles per hour, all the way up to Mach 1. And he assigned the first 5 rating bins of that scale to tornado damage, to various types of tornado damage that he observed in his surveys, going back in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. That's kind of the background for how the scale initially developed. He added F0 at the end of that to account for tornadoes that were weaker than hurricane force winds. And then he started applying it in real time in the early 1970s, 1971 and 1972, in those tornado seasons. Eventually, he showed that there was some usefulness, at least, to having these records of ratings where you could assign a broad wind speed range estimate to a given tornado, and then have a climatology of tornadoes across the United States developed based on that. And at the same time this was happening, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was beginning to build nuclear plants across the United States. And they wanted a sensible idea of what the worst tornado risk was going to be for a given area as they built the nuclear power plants, to know what the nuclear power plants needed to be able to withstand, because you don't want to withstand the minimum wind speed that an area is going to exist when you're dealing with a nuclear reactor. You want to withstand the worst case scenario, right? So the NRC funded several groups, several and primarily students, to develop the tornado climatology back to 1950, and they also in the years that followed after that, Tom Razoulis, a tornado researcher out of Vermont, expanded the climatology going all the way back into the 1880s through a 25-year effort that resulted in his famous Significant Tornadoes publication. And so all of these efforts were kind of built up in the 90s based on the old F scale, but not long after the F scale was deployed in the 70s, it was pretty well identified that the upper bounds, the upper ratings, the F3, F4, F5 rating wind speed ranges, which were 158 to 206 miles per hour for F3, 207 to 260 miles per hour for F4, and 261 to 318 miles per hour for F5, were probably overestimates for the types of damage needed for the types of damage associated with each rating range. So that's when the EF scale was initially conceived through a series of meetings in the early 2000s as a way to correct for these potential high biases in the wind speeds associated with the more severe damage to structures, and to develop a more standard and more in-depth catalog of structures that could be used to identify, to estimate tornado wind speeds. Because
the E being enhanced, right?
Correct. The enhanced Fujita scale, yeah. So the idea was taking the original Fujita scale, which should mention was focused on single-family site-built homes as the primary method for estimating the wind speed, the primary structure that could be used for estimating the wind speed, and expanding it out to a variety of different structures: mobile homes, power poles, and high tension transmission towers, cell phone towers, industrial buildings, warehouses, hospitals, low-rise buildings, high-rise buildings, automobile showrooms. These are all different kinds of structures that now can be used in the enhanced Fujita scale to estimate tornado wind speeds. That was deployed on February 1st, 2007 was when the EF scale was originally deployed. So it's now been about 18 years, a little over 18 years since the deployment of the EF scale. And one of the stated goals of the EF scale was to have a consistency in what the ratings meant from the old Fujita scale to the new EF scale. And so it's time, it's been about 18 years, and it was time to start doing an evaluation of how consistent the ratings have been. And one of the first places that we've started was looking at the top rating, the EF5 rating, or F5 rating in the past. One of the big motivations for starting here is that we're in a pretty historical lack of EF5 or F5 ratings across not just the United States, but by consequence, the globe, because the vast majority of them do happen here. We are now, it was May 20th, 2013, the Moore, Oklahoma tornado was the last one that was officially rated EF5 in the United States. And so we're now surpassed 12 years as of this month since we've had a tornado rated the EF5 rating. And we wanted to know how likely this was to be natural, like a naturally occurring drought, if you will, for lack of a better term, in EF5 ratings, and B, what might, if it's not naturally occurring, if it's not just a product of natural consequence, then what might be driving it? And that's what's really motivated our most recent research.
So you kind of touched on this, but not to give away the answer, but essentially, while it was not exact. This drought, as you said, is 12 years. The Fujita, the EF scale has been around 18 years. The first several years of the EF scale was, was a very active period, the 2011 outbreak. So it kind of, I think, and you and I obviously had conversations before you all worked on this paper, that it seemed a little more than just coincidental that, that once we got out of that particularly hyperactive, period, that they just seemed to shut off after we went to the EF scale, the higher end tornadoes. We actually had a question from one of our subscribers wanting to know how often did EF5 tornadoes generally occur in the U.S. prior to the 2013 tornado, and that's a good segue into what you all found in your research.
Yeah. So we combined the EF scale era leading up to this gap in EF5, so up through 2013. And then with the Fujita scale era, not only the real-time application era, which is about from the mid-1970s when the National Weather Service adopted it formally through 2006, but also back through the era where the Nuclear Regulatory Commission funded the studies to backfill the tornado record across the United States, and Grzulis's studies, and took that all the way back to 1880 and combined them into one seamless data set. And if you looked, the approach we took was to look at a calendar year, a given calendar year, and what the probability was that in any given calendar year, you would have at least one F5 or EF5 rated tornado in that 134-year record, doing my math correctly. Yes, it was 134 years, calendar years. And the probability was about 44%. So you average about one every other year, or every other year there'd be at least one. When you account for years that had multiple F5s or multiple EF5s, that probability would go up a little bit. You'd be up to about 1 or 2 every 3 years on average when you account for like the 1974s and the 2011s and other years that had multiple. So the first approach we took, and the one that we published in the BAMS article, was to look at the probability that you would see 10 consecutive calendar years without an EF5 or F5 rated tornado, at least one, without at least one. And that's simply taking that 44% probability that you would see one, inverting it to the 56% probability that a given calendar year wouldn't have in F5 or EF5, and then taking that to the 10th power, because each year having a F5 or EF5 is an independent event. And so simply 56% to the 10th power is a probability of 0.3% that this is a naturally occurring phenomenon based on 134 prior years of record.
So rather low.
Really, really low.
Yeah.
And if you add in, so the study period was through the end of 2023. If you add in those 10 years from 2014 through 2023, and then calculate what the probability of an F5 or an EF5 would be occurring in a given year, it drops from 44% to 41%, which is a pretty dramatic drop. Coincidentally, we did, in the review process, we opted not to put this in the final paper, but we did a Poisson probability just to see what would happen if you accounted for the years with the multiple fives. And that probability the probability of this drought being natural drops, using the Poisson probability, drops from 0.3% to 0.06%.
Wow.
So it seems rather unlikely. And so we had to go through then and try to figure out what's actually going on.
And so I know that, and obviously you can go into more detail about this, but one of the things you did was looked at the tornadoes during that period that were close to being EF5s, and tried to do a bit more, I guess I would say, of a deep dive into those storms. And so what did you all find as you did that?
So we looked at all of the EF4s, all EF4s actually, since the deployment of the EF scale that fell with that, because now we do see there's a pretty standard practice for, especially for more intense tornadoes, to assign a specific maximum wind speed estimate to each tornado. It's actually become very common for pretty much every tornado now, which we can talk about more later. But it's been particularly common for the higher end tornadoes, basically since the deployment of the EF scale. So we went back and looked at all of the tornadoes that are within the about 10 to 11 mile per hour range of the EF4 to EF5 threshold. So the top end of EF4 is now 200 miles per hour, and EF5 begins at 201 miles per hour. So we looked at all the EF4s where the maximum estimated wind speed was between 190 and 200 miles per hour. And one of the first things we found was that for every case we could find where, which structure, which damage indicator was used to assign that maximum wind speed rate and maximum rating estimate, for every single case, which is all but 2 of the EF4s that reached this threshold, that we could find the maximum damage indicator. The maximum damage indicator was a site-built single-family home. And we suspect for the 2 tornadoes we couldn't find specific, precise information on that was also the case, given the survey narrative, the survey descriptions from the Weather Service. But for the sake of being thorough, we excluded those 2 tornadoes. But it still stands that pretty much every high-end, really high-end tornado rating in the EF scale era, almost every single one of them is driven by the single-family home, which is the common damage indicator from the old Fujita scale to the new enhanced Fujita, the EF scale. And so that caused us to look more closely at that damage indicator and how it works in the EF scale and at the EF4, EF5 threshold. So if you're not familiar with the semantics of the EF scale, you have these different kinds of structures that you can use to rate a tornado. And then for each of those kinds of structures, there are 28 of them in the current version of the EF scale. There are what we call degrees of damage, or DODs, that describe the type of damage observed to that structure caused by the tornado. So for a site-built single-family home, there are 10 of these, and the top one is a site-built single-family home that is swept off its foundation with most of the debris cleared away from the slab or the basement. And so for each degree of damage, there are 3 wind speed values given. One wind speed value is the expected wind speed, or assuming that, or if the building is observed to be of typical standard construction. And then there's a lower bound wind speed for structures that have structural defects or aren't built to code. And then you have the upper bound for structures that are stronger than code or built above code. And so you can assign, based off a damage indicator and its degree, the observed degree of damage, a wind speed somewhere within the range of the lower bound to the upper bound wind speed. And you start with the assumption of the expected value when you evaluate the building. When the EF scale was originally created, this is a little bit of history here. In the very first iteration of the EF scale, well before it was deployed, a couple of years before it was deployed, there was originally not even a DOD-10, a swept away single family home. That was added before it was deployed, but in I think the second primary draft of the scale. And in the when it was added, the wind speed value that was assigned to it for the expected value, the starting point wind speed when you do the assessment of a swept away house, was 200 miles per hour. Now, at the time, in the development of the scale, 200 miles per hour was actually the start of EF5 because, and this goes again back into how this scale was developed. The way that the wind speed ranges were developed for the EF scale was that there were two independent groups of survey experts that were asked to evaluate the different damage indicators and degrees of damage that were proposed for the scale. The first group developed the actual wind speed estimates, the expected value, lower bound, upper bound wind speeds for every single degree of damage for every single damage indicator on the EF scale. And then the second group independently was asked for each degree of damage to assign a rating from the old Fujita scale. Even though the old Fujita scale wasn't developed for these damage indicators, they were asked to give their best estimate of what the rating would be associated with a given structure and a given type of damage. And then the two values were compared for every single DI and or damage indicator and every single degree of damage. And it turned out that the mathematical comparison was actually pretty good. It was there was a strong correlation between what the EF scale wind speeds were and the estimated to be, and the F scale wind speeds were estimated to be. They weren't a perfect slope because for the stronger damage, the EF scale wind speeds were estimated to be lower than the F scale, but the actual match, the strength of the match was pretty close. So the equation that fell out from that was actually used to convert all of the wind speed bins from the old Fujita scale to the wind speed bins for the EF scale. So for instance, at the top end at EF4, or F4 to EF4, F4 was originally 207 and 260 miles per hour. Those two top end values were put through this equation that was developed by polling these two expert groups. And the wind speed range that came out was 168 to 199 miles per hour. And then, or 100, I believe it was either 167 or 168, but the top end was 199. And then the F5 to EF5 conversion F5 went from 261 to 318 miles per hour to EF5 becoming 200 to 234 miles per hour. So once that conversion was done, that was the original conversion of F scale wind speeds to EF scale wind speeds. And so the swept away home at 200 miles per hour after this original conversion was an EF5 rating example for the expected value wind speed for a swept away home in the EF scale. Before the EF scale was finally published and deployed, though, one more step was taken. And that step was to take each wind speed range for each EF scale rating category and round the wind speeds at 5 mile per hour increments so as to not convey more certainty in the wind speed estimates than actually exists. The rounding, however, was applied to the top end of each bin, of each wind speed bin. So for instance, even though EF5 began at a round 5 mile per hour increment of 200 miles per hour, the issue was that EF4 ended at 199 miles per hour. And so the rounding being applied at the top of each wind speed category meant that EF4 had to be rounded from ending at 199 to ending at 200, which then forced EF5 to begin at 201 miles per hour instead of 200, which then led to the 200 mile per hour starting point wind speed for a house being swept away to be a starting point rating of EF4 instead of EF5, even though the single family home being swept away was the common damage indicator between F5 on the old Fujita scale and what was supposed to be EF5 on the enhanced Fujita scale. So it created this rating inconsistency for a standard construction single family home being swept away, where On the old Fujita scale, it started at F5, and now on the enhanced Fujita scale, it technically starts at EF4, even though it's within 1 mile per hour of EF5. It is literally a rounding issue.
Yeah, and well, a couple things I'll just say. First, I mean, I've literally been involved in doing tornado damage ratings all the way back into the 90s. And I can say pretty confidently that, not only the surveys I've done, but, talking to a lot of colleagues over the years, that single family home swept away is pretty much the defining, damage indicator for an F5 tornado. And the fact that it went from being the F5 to under the EF scale being default at the top end of EF4, obviously that's a huge potential issue. And I think that boils down to a lot of what you all have found. Then the other thing, I'll just kind of as an aside, and I'll say this so that I won't put you on the spot, but this idea of tornadoes being rated with very precise wind speeds is something that I really, I'm glad to know that they were trying to avoid that, but it doesn't seem like it's been very successful, because I see a lot of tornadoes rated with like 128 mile an hour winds, and the reality is we don't have that kind of precision to be able to estimate, and having really should be a range of wind speed that we're applying to these tornadoes, because I mean, when you're looking at the wide variety of damage that occurs within any tornado, the fact of the matter is the best we can do is really just provide an estimate.
Yep. And I mean, when you can think about it this way, the goal, the point of the rating system, right, was to provide this broad estimate. If you start assigning a wind speed, a top wind speed value, singular, what you're ending up essentially doing is you're assigning a wind speed rating, a wind speed estimate, and a rating. And so you're essentially saying that it's within this rating range. So say, for instance, you have an EF4 tornado where the wind speed range of the EF4 category is 166 to 200 miles per hour. And you assign a 190 mile per hour wind speed estimate. What you accidentally end up implying is that there are equal probabilities that the peak wind speed was somewhere between this range of 166 to 190 miles per hour, this 25 mile per hour wind speed range, versus 190 to 200 miles per hour, this 10 mile per hour wind speed range. You essentially throw off the Gaussian probability, right? If you assign a specific wind speed in there, without acknowledging that in reality, if you think that the peak probability wind speed is something closer to the top end of the range, a lot of that tail goes into, let's say, EF5 when it comes to, or if it's at the top of EF3, it goes into EF4. So it's a difficult problem. I mean, one of the challenges here is we are gaining better understanding through observations and through engineering and studies and analyses of the wind speeds and the forces and the loads that are applied to buildings in tornadoes. And so we are improving our understanding to some degree, and it is giving us a little bit more confidence in some of the wind speed estimates. But the reality is it's hard to do in-depth analyses still on every single building, which was Fujita's main takeaway back in the early 70s when creating the rating scale, is that it's still not feasible to do a forensic engineering analysis of every structure impacted by a tornado. And it still leaves us with a lot of uncertainty in terms of how we actually estimate tornado intensity.
as with so many other things in the atmosphere, you have to accept that there's a lot of uncertainty and that you have to really take some probabilistic approaches. You mentioned, Tony, when you were talking about how this all got started about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, starting this, wanting to look at, to better understand what the risk was to nuclear power plants. And in fact, the nuclear power plant in Mississippi, Grand Gulf, was one of the ones that was looked at because a significant tornado impacted that facility back in I believe it was the mid 70s. And that was one of the, one that they had Fujita do a very detailed, in-depth analysis of. But it's interesting that was kind of the impetus for this becoming an official way in which tornadoes were rated, because that, to me, the whole climatology and how engineers, build buildings knowing what the potential risk of a tornado, of a given intensity of a tornado at a given point is really an important aspect of this whole effort. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see as kind of the climatological impact here of what you and your co-authors have found as far as, well, number one, what the impact you feel like is on the climatology of EF5s, and then number two, were there any other issues like this you found in looking at the F scale versus the EF scale?
Yeah, so when it comes to EF5s, that is a hard question to answer from a climatological perspective, because even going back to the 1880s, EF5s and F5s are climatologically rare events. We had to go back all the way to 1880 just to get a data set with 100 F5 or EF5 tornadoes, because there are fewer than one per year. Even back in the era where ratings were being assigned more readily to those at that level, you still average at most one per year in any sort of era, and usually less than that. So a lot of times when we do statistical and climatological analyses, we combine 4s and 5s into one category, into a violent tornado category, to bolster our statistical methods of analysis. And because in reality, there is a difference. There is definitely a difference between 4s and 5s in terms of the amount of damage they cause overall, and even the fatality risk, or the long-term fatality risk as displayed by the ratings. But that very question has been what's been motivating some of the most recent research I've been conducting here, and it led to a paper that is in its second round of review right now for the monthly weather review publication, where we're looking. I've been looking more directly at the consistency of ratings as a whole between the F scale and the EF scale eras. And one thing that I found, so I went through, we have about 10 years now of record where we actually keep these precise wind speed estimates, and they're kept in something called the Damage Assessment Toolkit by the National Weather Service. They often get transferred now into the official storm data publication also. So I did an analysis looking at both sources, starting with the official source, which is storm data. That's our official way of keeping climate record and weather records in the United States. And then looking at the DAT to fill in the cases where the wind speed estimate isn't printed in storm data, but is provided in another format. And so looking at almost 12,000 tornadoes in a 10-year period from 2014, that same 10 years from 2014 through 2023, the period that spans this EF5 drought, I went ahead and gathered wind speed information on every tornado that has it available of those 12,000, which is about 8,400 of them. And went through and looked at started with the ratings. The rating the rating records in that period, compared them to the last 30 years of the Fujita scale, which happens to be correspond to roughly the time the National Weather Service was applying them in real time. And the other importance of using 30 years is it's also the standard for like temperature and precipitation climatologies in the normal and average highs and lows and precip that are reported by news sources and by the Weather Service. It's a 30-year record. We call it climate record. And so I created a 30-year climate record of Fujita scale ratings from the last 30 years of the Fujita scale, compared it to this 10-year record of the enhanced Fujita scale. And it turns out, not only is there a complete lack of EF5s, but there is a significantly large downtrend in the numbers of EF4 and EF3 ratings. When you look at populations of all tornadoes rated F2 or EF2 or greater, for record keeping purposes, we keep everything EF2 or greater as a significantly intense tornado damage event, and then the numbers of 2s or greater as a whole have stayed roughly consistent in those two periods, but the fractions of those tornadoes that are 3, 4, and 5 all have gone down significantly, while the fraction of 2s has gone up. And then that has downstream implications in terms of, for instance, how deadly is the typical EF3 tornado, or how deadly is the typical EF4 tornado? In the 30-year climatology of the Fujita scale, an F4 tornado killed on average 2.3 people per tornado. In the 10-year climatology of the enhanced Fujita scale, that averages up to about 6.5, 6.6. So you have an almost, like a 2.5 times increase in the number of fatalities per tornado rated of 4 in the last 10 years than you have in the 30-year Fujita scale data set. And part of that is because if you look at the 5s in the Fujita scale era, they average 14 fatalities per F5 tornado. And so tornadoes that used to get F5 ratings, they're now getting EF4 ratings, and the higher fatality rates associated with them are factoring into the fatality rates for EF4s instead of fatality rates for EF5s, which then poses all sorts of existential questions about like impact and intensity-based guidance that are being developed experimentally and starting to be deployed operationally. When you're trying to estimate the threat and the hazard associated with severe storms, and you're trying to estimate based on the intensity of or potential intensity of tornadoes, and how we gauge the intensity of tornadoes is changing over time, how does that factor into the quality of the products that we're producing? And that's a big unknown that is going to need a lot more study still.
Yeah, and we're approaching the end of our time here, and I know I got to let you get back to doing the research you're doing on your board back there. So you kind of touched on this, but this is going to take a lot more research to kind of figure out where to go from here. But do you have any preliminary thoughts on either what sort of actions the community could take? Because I'm just speaking for myself. I feel like the work that you all have done and that you've outlined today shows that there's definitely an artificial climatological adjustment here in the tornado database that we need to be looking at and understanding and potentially figuring out what we're going to do about it. So I guess my question is, number one, do you have any preliminary ideas on that based on your research, and or what would you like to look at next to help you better understand what we might be able to do to kind of fix what you found?
Yeah, I mean, and that is a really good and really complicated question. Step one, which is what we have been doing with the EF5 article in BAMS and with this upcoming article in Monthly Weather Review, is simply bringing awareness to the community that these inconsistencies are occurring in the data record. And the community is becoming aware of that and starting to address that. I mean, Alan mentioned, we mentioned the committees that we sit on, the ASC, AMS. The EF5 question for single family homes has come up, and I know there have been some fixes that have been proposed and even voted on, but they still need to have additional votes and then be implemented before they take effect. One potential would be to directly address the single family home damage indicator wind speed for a swept away home, to make it start at EF5, like it started on the Fujita scale at F5. Another one would be to look at the actual wind speed ranges of the enhanced Fujita scale itself. And that's kind of a thought exercise that I do in the monthly weather review and in the BAMS article. We look at what happened if you lowered the EF5 threshold from 201 miles per hour to 190 miles per hour. Well, all of a sudden you end up with, over the last 10 years, a frequency of EF5 tornadoes that matches the prior 134 before it. I mean, to the point where I mentioned how the calendar year probability of an EF5 or F5 dropped from 44% to 41% when you include the last 10 years of no F5s or EF5s. If you take all those 190 or greater EF4s and make them 5s, and then recalculate that probability, it goes from 44% to 43.6%. So almost no change. And so that's another potential avenue is, how married are we as a community to EF3 being 136 to 165 miles per hour, EF4 being 166 to 200, and EF5 being 201 or greater? Are we really stuck to that and is there a specific reason why? Or is it that the kinds of damage associated with the rating we find to be more associated with just maybe slightly lower wind speeds on a whole, given how we apply the wind speed estimates? Because one of the things that has really changed significantly in the last 10 years, and it happened right around the 2013-14 timeframe, was that we started using what's called the damage assessment toolkit to assign tornado ratings. And it's a powerful and fantastic tool for allowing in-depth and comprehensive tornado surveys on a lot more tornadoes, because it's a tool that you can literally use on your phone, and it uses the GPS position on your phone and the camera feature. Allows you to take a picture, go through the app that it runs on, find the type of building that it was impacted, and then find the degree of damage that occurred to that building. And then it immediately populates that expected value wind speed as a starting point, and then allows you to toggle between the range from the lower bound to the upper bound. So the way that this works ultimately is, for a tornado, you find all the damage indicators, all the degrees of damage, and they all populate with these initial wind speeds, and then the ratings are assigned based off that. That is completely inverted from how the first 40 years of the Fujita scale and the EF scale were, where you went out, conducted a damage survey. And I mean, this even goes back to, I'm just old enough to remember have been trained on this method originally, right? You go out, you find a damaged structure, and you would assign a rating first, and then potentially back out a wind speed or a wind speed range based off that rating. If you had enough experts involved, to get a little more precision on the wind speed. Otherwise, it would often just be the wind speed range associated with that rating category. But so in that 13-14 timeframe, we inverted the process for rating tornadoes from assigning the rating, estimating the wind speed, to estimating the wind speed, assigning the rating. And it's possible, but we can't say for sure, that's the entire reason how we got here, is this very powerful and fantastic tool has kind of changed the perspective of how we assign ratings to tornadoes. And it's kind of leading to this incidental EF3, EF4, EF5 decrease over time, because we're starting with these assigned wind speeds. And that question then becomes, well, are we really married to the wind speeds that, again, we have better engineering knowledge and application than we had even when the EF scale was first developed? Are we really married to those wind speed ranges being tied to the ratings as they are now? And that's something the community will need to have more discussion about.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think when I think about it, just as myself as a member of the community, and obviously this is something where we need to have this conversation, because there's a lot of different stakeholders in the community. And it's not just meteorologists, it's engineers, it's social scientists, it's climatologists. So there's a lot to be discussed here. But when I think about it as somebody who's been at this for going on 4 decades now, I want to be able to know how the climatology. I want to have confidence that the climatology means the same thing now that it did in the 1970s. And trust me, I know that there were already reasons why that might not be the case. But at a minimum, we need to understand what the potential, pitfalls and issues are. And I think that, you all have done a great job in giving us a really good in-depth look at some of the challenges that we can now recognize now that we have, almost 20 years with the enhanced Fujita scale.
Yep.
Well, we're coming up to the end of the hour, so we probably should wrap it up there. Tony, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and being the kind of guinea pig for balanced weather science video. And hopefully this will lead to some conversation and discussion amongst some of the folks that read and follow balanced weather. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to bring you back on again. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed talking about this.
All right. Thanks. And we'll be back with another one of these soon for those of you subscribing to Balanced Weather. And how do I stop? I assume it will just stop when I cut off. All right. Anything else you want to? All right.
I think that's about it.
All right. Well, thanks, man. Hopefully you felt like that was worth it.
Oh yeah, no, I love talking about this stuff. And
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, man. Thanks. Have a good rest of the day, and talk to you soon.
Yep. See you later.
All right, man.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.